Alright, I'm fairly sure the Dragonflight actually changed its plan quite significantly. I mean, if you take a look at the launch storylines and you kind of contrast them with how the expansion went, and you think about the sorts of things that seem to be important in 10.0 or things that were perhaps foreshadowed, and then some out-of-game things like dev interviews, then you track them forward to the present day and you see a lot of them were just dropped, never really mentioned again. It's all quite strange, and I think that change coincides with a fairly massive thing, which is the 3 expansion plan that is to follow Dragonflight actually coming into being, and that happening after the launch of the Dragonflight expansion. That is what we're going to talk about today. If you felt with this expansion that something has just not been quite right, well, hopefully you find today's video interesting, just as you'll find today's sponsor interesting, who are actually working for me right now. Spam mails, spam calls. They're a real problem, and it's all because of data brokers, whose trade is literally harvesting and selling your data. It sucks. Now, you've got the legal right to have your stuff taken down, but the downside is that takes hours, and it's a game of whack-a-mole. And that is where Incogni.com/Bellular Warcraft comes in. They automate it for you, and code Bellular Warcraft gets you 60% off an annual plan. I signed up and immediately they found me on 48 data brokers, sent 42 takedown requests, and completed 6. The timing was just hilarious. Like, the day I set Incogni up, I got a spam message from a recruiter, and then going through the Incogni dashboard, I saw that my details were on a platform for recruiters. And I sure as hell didn't put it there. I mean, who knows where it came from, but it had to have come from somewhere. Remember things like the big Equifax data breach? More recently, the Comcast Xfinity one that had a breach of 35 million accounts. The brokers hoover that stuff up and they just make money off it. And it actually gets spooky. Like, people can quite easily find your information in sites like Being Verified, which is, yeah, not cool. And the thing is, even if you do a takedown request, your data can just pop up again. That's a real killer feature with Incogni. They take your data down and then they continually rescan so that they can keep it down. All automatically, so give them a shot today at Incogni.com/Bellular Warcraft, code Bellular Warcraft for an exclusive 60% off discount. We've got to kick it off with context and staff. The context is pretty simple. The vast majority of people seemed to be particularly unhappy with the narrative direction of World of Warcraft. Because yes, in the active WoW community, plenty of us were having a discussion about whether things were good or bad. The thing that we perhaps missed is, well, all of the people who were no longer playing World of Warcraft, who saw Shadowlands, thought it was a bit preposterous, saw all the PC Gamer headlines about just how bad its narrative was, and therefore decided not to really touch the game. This is something that was decently recently spoken to by Holly Longdale in an interview. She said, and do mind, she has been playing World of Warcraft since its original beta in the early 2000s. So she said that as a player, something was kind of feeling off, that the narrative somewhat lost its way. And I think with all of that context in mind, we've got to talk about staffing as our first point. Don't worry, all of those juicy things about plot lines that were dropped, I'll get into that, but we've got to talk about the people first. The most obvious one is Chris Metzen. He returned to Blizzard as creative advisor in December 2022. Now, I'm aware not all of you will know everything about him. TLDR, he joins Blizzard way back in the day. He's doing art in Warcraft 1. He ends up doing a bunch of backstory for his drawings, and that essentially morphs into him having way more of a role in Warcraft 2, and then he basically ends up being Blizzard's story dude. So he has a big tenure at the company and he ends up leaving after Overwatch, right? And one of the final things that he worked on World of Warcraft, funny enough, was the Battle for Azeroth cinematic. You know, that cinematic that was really good and felt absolutely nothing like the expansion they went on to ship. You know, because BFA was a narrative mess and the cinematic actually looked pretty cool. Anyway, by September 2023, Chris Metzen was the executive creative director and was working full-time on World of Warcraft. He was not just doing some advice and consulting in the franchise, nope. He's kind of got a day job now. Other people, like Holly Longdale, of course, started to take a little bit more prominence, and then BlizzCon made things pretty damn clear. But while BlizzCon was making things look rather clear and telling us about this whole 3 expansion arc, someone was very clearly missing. That person was Steve Denuser. Now, that's a relevant person to talk about because he was the past narrative director of World of Warcraft, I believe starting some point in BFA, doing that in Shadowlands, and of course, Dragonflight. Now, per Towley, who's a streamer who knows loads of people at Blizzard, well, the quote from Towley is that Dragonflight was Steve's baby. Yet, this expansion was a narrative mess. It wasn't a disaster like Shadowlands, it was just a mess. It didn't really feel like it went to plan. I'm fairly sure that Steve was working pretty heavily in 10.0, but I've got to be honest with you, seeing so many things in 10.0 and how they didn't really seem to be taken forward, it does make me think that that vision changed. So what happened is, we noticed there was no Steve Danuser at BlizzCon, and that was pretty bizarre because he used to be the narrative director. Now by that time, I had already privately heard that he was gone, but the word wasn't out yet. That word got out quite recently with his LinkedIn page being updated. That led to a whole wave of news and him doing an interview with PC Gamer, one where he essentially said that the move was intentional, it's time to move on to some new things, and that part of his decision was formed by wanting to stay in the city that he was in rather than relocating to California. So, that's what he said. I know that I have heard things that would certainly suggest there's a bit more to it than that, maybe some creative differences. Broadly, I think the PC Gamer interview is pretty much right. I do think that he left of his own accord. The thing is, I have heard one or two things that maybe suggest there's more to that story, but I basically don't have any details, and certainly not with a level of certainty that I'd feel comfortable sharing in a public fashion. Now, one thing I did see which raised the eyebrow was somebody who was from his era who's no longer at the company making a series of posts that appeared to be airing grievances with Blizzard, not Steve, to be clear, but they ended up taking them down, and by the time that I saw that, basically they'd posted a tweet saying, "Yep, I've deleted all those, I will tweet about this later when I am not mad," and to my knowledge there has been no follow-up. So, who knows? Maybe there is a story. Maybe it will come out. What do we do with that information? Well, certainly what we don't do is just go off half-cocked. Now look, if you and I are hanging out in a pub and we've had a few beers, maybe we can talk shit about theories and that sort of thing. But no, when I'm sitting down and it's on the channel, like, there's got to be a certain bar of evidence and hearing things from many, many, many different sources before I can feel comfortable actually talking about something, because accuracy and the truth is actually an important thing. My personal suspicion is that there was some sort of creative friction. I do believe, and the whole point of this video is that there has been some form of major change or sort of reshaping to take existing plans and put them into the World Soul Saga mold. What I do know, though, is this. The last few years have been the absolute worst in terms of WoW's narrative. And no, this is not just a thing for the lore nerds. When I say that, I mean how the game universe feels, right? Like, yeah, there's loads of raiders who don't know a single shred of WoW's lore, but you know what? Whenever something is cool and big and, you know, all of those things that Legion did well, they, for some reason, just end up enjoying it that little bit more. Is what this duo of Chris's will cook up. What we overall know, though, is that War Within was planned before Chris Metzen returned. World Soul Saga is, from everything that I've heard, Chris Metzen's thing. That basically means that 10.0's content was very likely written, almost certainly was written, with the War Within in mind. Going back to Towley saying that Dragonflight was Steve Danuser's baby, you can then also assume that the original plan for the War Within was also his baby, and the narrative. Dragonflight culminated with the Emerald Dream. That's a plotline that in a way is coming full circle from the Dream's initial introduction as being Ysera's realm. So Ysera kind of had to be there. Problem is, she was dead, but with Shadowlands she was far from gone. Her return had been foreshadowed in patch 9.2.5, and almost immediately Dragonflight decided to pull that thread, but it added something with Malfurion. For her to return, he must take her place. Some beta data mining made people think that he was going to die, so in and around that time, narrative director Steve Danuser tried to clarify in an interview saying that Malfurion would not be gone forever, but that he would return with two things. One, new perspective, and two, some new powers. Yeah, those were the words of a man with a plan. At the time, he talked about Persephone spending 6 months a year in hell, all of that lovely stuff. Many almost expected a Malfurion coming out of Ardenweald that could do, I don't know, blue magic. Anyway, a year or so passed, in patch 10.2, Malfurion returned, with absolutely nothing of what Danuser suggested. No new power, no interaction with the A-plot whatsoever. No new perspective that is unique with what he did, for the Winter Queen. Absolutely nothing. He just came back and decided to retire, and I can't blame him. To me, that was bizarre. It felt like evidence, and it did go along with a general feeling that myself, Matt, and Jared, who, we do a lot of the lore stuff in this channel, we'd all just felt this around the middle of Dragonflight, where it felt rushed, it felt sloppy. Do you remember how we learned the name of Ymir Drasil? It was just a little teaser cinematic at the end of 10.1. Malfurion's return, though, was so the opposite of what Steve Denuser said it would be, that given his departure from the team, and it seeming like a lot of change has happened, well, we just thought, okay, this is an expansion that pivoted. And that made me think, is there a reason behind the sloppiness of this expansion? Well, it's more than just Malfurion. One thing I've seen a lot of fans talk about is Vakthros, right? Used to be one of Malygos' seats of power, and like with the Life Shrines or the Obsidian Citadel, it was a key part of the Isles. And it was there on our world map, this unique location, but one where very little happened. Now, and it was only really explained by clicking on a stone tablet you could find up in the tower. Of course, so who knows? There could be something here. Maybe Vakthros did have grander plans at one stage, but what I'm a lot more sure on is Tyr. What was the point of Tyr? I have no idea. I mean, I'm glad he's back, but look at it in-game. He had zero connection to the A-plot of the Dragonflight expansion. And I just do not buy that that was the original plan. Especially given a lot of the more direct interacting with sort of Titan-forged characters as the dragons were trying to work out how to get their power back. It just seems a lot of that was completely dropped. Now, realistically, the new hands behind the wheel, they were only really starting to figure out what that lore meant for the World Soul Saga's new direction. So perhaps Tyr's silence is a sign that they weren't really quite ready to reveal things or to use him. But speaking of Dragonflight's launch, there's another weird thing. The Oath Stones. Our motivation from the Waking Shore through to the later stages of Tenno's plot was to empower the Oath Stones of each flight and to activate the Mother Oath Stone. What is an Oath Stone? What do they do? How do they work? Who knows? And that's a question that doesn't even matter because they were completely forgotten and never mentioned by other characters beyond 10.0. Yes, each dragon spent all of this time trying to restore their power, restore their Oathstone in 10.0, and they just didn't mention them anymore. I mean, these feel like an even more poorly explained version of, the jailer hunting his sigils. Yeah, weird, disjointed. They made a big deal out of it only to do absolutely nothing with it and no follow-up. Take a character like Nosdormu. I mean, what we expected is that events would sort of kick off the long-awaited turn to Morozond, but instead we got a caper by Iridikron that involved Proto-Nosdormu turning into Morozond? Not our Nosdormu, because he was outside? It was weird. And then by the very end, well, we essentially just reset his plot. Morozond's death in the Cataclysm is still his death from everything that we know, and our Nosdormu hasn't turned into Morozond yet. We haven't seen that happen. And that's all in service of Iridikron dropping by to tell us that actually he's just been promoted to franchise-wide villain. And he goes through the Void Portal and we all think, huh, that was a bit interesting, didn't expect that. And that with Iridikron is bizarre, especially in the light of Ian Hazzikostas' words. You see, Ian said in an interview, I believe before Dragonflight came out, that we would actually have a good idea of who this expansion's final boss would be by the end of 10.0. Now, by the end of 10.0, everything pointed to Iridikron. I do not buy that anyone would have thought that Farak would be the end villain by that stage in 10.0. The more and more to me, it looks like that shift happened, that it happened quite shortly after 10.0, and that's maybe why some things changed a bit. I mean, hell, even just think of the very messy nature of this expansion's middle period, The narrative of 10.1 mostly being a family drama with, environmental things like this entire boss room posing the most obvious and simple of questions that, for some weird reason, no character in the game even comes close to investigating. Like, that was bizarre. 10.1 just wasn't interested in its most interesting elements. Okay, that was a weird sentence, but still, you get my point. Thoroughly bizarre. And then take Vyranoth. We all expected her to probably end up being our ally, but, I mean, she turned so quickly that it didn't feel organic as a point of the story. So my broad point here is fairly simple. Dragonflight, as it was set up in 10.0, just is full of missed opportunities. And a lot of things that seemed to matter barely ended up mattering, like the Oathstones, or perhaps like all that time they spent setting up Decay with Brackenhide Hollow. That was irrelevant going forward. Yet for all of these small to medium-sized questions, well, the World Soul Saga at BlizzCon did kind of make it all make sense. The bridge from Dragonflight to the War Within via Khaz Algar fit, because of course the War Within would have been in production before Dragonflight launched. And of course that was the case. Dragonflight was always going to lead into the War Within. That hadn't changed. What had, though, I believe, is the 3 expansion arc that would follow, because we pretty much know that comes from Chris Metzen, and he only came back after 10.0. And that, I believe, is fundamental to Dragonflight's unclear direction and questions both left unasked and unanswered. What we're left with, though, is a very well-stocked narrative toy box and new direction. Are the dark times over? That's probably what you're wondering, and to be honest, tying this video together has been really hard. I've ranged from doing narrative summaries to lore predictions, but really I don't think that actually matters too much. I think the question that, I have as a fan, and you probably have, is just, look, will it suck? Is there actually a direction? Well, obviously I can't tell you that because it hasn't happened yet, but here's how I feel in the issue. Whatever had been going on at Blizzard wasn't working, right? BFA was a mess, and Shadowlands sucked. Shadowlands didn't just suck in implementation. Its ideas were bad. It was barking up the wrong tree. It was not the right creative direction for World of Warcraft fundamentally. So to me, it feels like the middle of Dragonflight is almost an older vision of what Dragonflight could be, somewhat being sacrificed so that the World Soul Saga could make sense. Maybe that's the sort of parachuting of Iridikron out of this expansion and way over to the future. And I think that's probably a good move because, let's be real, Iridikron's actually pretty damn great. And that's how I'm feeling. Yeah, Iridikron's great. Xal'atath, great. The War Within cinematic, that was pitch perfect. I think that was probably some of their finest work ever. Our next expansion has many elements that feel core Warcraft to me. Earthen, Nerubians, fire and light-powered paladins. After that, Quel'Thalas. Holy shit, right? Full fat Quel'Thalas, not just the sort of janky TBC version. That's crazy. After that, a total revamp of Northrend. That sounds terrific. This team's leadership is aware of the game's narrative problems. There have been fairly clear changes in direction. They've shown that they're able to listen to things. And, unlike the past, it actually seems they do have a solid multi-year plan instead of just having some ideas and knowing what the next expansion would be. So, to me, everything looks up. To me, it just seems like the Warcraft team spent quite a lot of time without strong, big-picture creative direction, both as a game and also sort of narratively. And I think Shadowlands really falling so hard on the game mechanics front, that just led to the mechanics improving. Like, we see that they listen. On the creative front, that's always a little bit harder. But I actually do think that they're open to that criticism, open to that feedback. There's what Holly has said, there's quite literally been changes, and that confidence and vision that they were projecting at BlizzCon. To me, that felt stronger. Not everything's perfect, but I do get a sense of vision from the game. I think that's maybe the thing it's been lacking. Who knows how the future will go? I think it'll go better than the recent past, though. I actually do think that is literally cause for hope. Hope or hopium? Only time will tell. Okay, that's it for me. Let me know what you think. Do you think this expansion had a big pivot in the middle? I think it did. Okay, I'll see you next time.